The silence in the Siam taiga was not an absence of sound, but its essence. It consisted of the barely audible rustling of cedar branches under the pressure of the autumn wind, the distant, almost ghostly cry of a cedar grouse, and the measured, calm breathing of a man lying on the damp moss. Ivan Belov, who had been called Raven behind his back and to his face for 20 years, did not move. He was part of this forest, an extension of the old fallen tree behind which he had made his bed. His body, accustomed to long hours of immobility, did not ache or freeze. He simply waited. Next to him, pressed against his side, lay his dog, Shadow. The dog was as quiet and motionless as her owner. Only the tips of her ears twitched slightly, catching and analyzing every rustle, every breath of wind. They were a single organism, tuned to the same wavelength, the wavelength of survival and hunting. Their target was a poacher, not just some drunk with a gun who decided to shoot out of boredom, but a real pro. A cautious, cunning beast in human form, who had been leading the local gamekeeping service on a wild goose chase for 3 weeks. He left no traces that an ordinary person could read. He moved against the wind, used animal trails, and knew how to cover his tracks, like only the most experienced predators do. But Raven didn't just read the tracks on the ground. He read the forest. He saw a branch that had been broken in a way that an elk couldn't have done it. He smelled the faint, foreign scent of tobacco that the wind had carried several kilometers. He heard the abnormal silence that comes when the forest senses the presence of a stranger. For him, the taiga was a book written in a language he had known since childhood. And in that language, the poacher left entire sentences. They had been tracking him for 2 days. The Raven knew that today it would all end. He could feel it in the way the wind had changed, in the behavior of the birds, in the special, ringing tension that hung in the air. The poacher was tired. He had made a mistake, just one. He had walked past an old, lichen-covered kurumnik, leaving almost invisible scratches from the horseshoes on his boots on the stones. For Raven, it was like riding on asphalt. He knew that in a couple of hours, his target would come out onto a small clearing near the pass, where he most likely had a hiding place. There, in the open, he would have no chance. Raven wasn't going to kill him. He was just going to take him, quietly, without a single shot, just like you take a tired animal that's gotten caught in a trap. And at that moment, when his whole world, his whole universe, had narrowed down to this clearing, to this smell of pine needles and rotten leaves, the silence was broken by the most monstrous, most unnatural sound that could be imagined in this. Blaz. The piercing, insolent trill of a satellite phone. It hit his ears like a slap in the face, destroying all the magic, all the harmony of the moment. The shadow jumped up, growling quietly. Raven grimaced, as if from a toothache. He took the device out of his backpack. The screen lit up with a name he hadn't seen in almost a year. Major Gromov. Gromov was the only thread connecting him to the world he had left behind many years ago, the world of cities, asphalt, and human laws. Yes, Raven said into the receiver. His voice was hoarse from long silence. Ivan, thank God you're there. The Major's tired but insistent voice came through the receiver. I need your help. Urgently. Drop everything and come back to the city. Voron was silent. He looked at the very clearing where his poacher was about to emerge. "I'm busy, Semyonich," he replied. "I have work to do here." "Your work can wait," Gromov cut him off. "We have something here that you've never seen in your taiga. We have a missing person." The Raven smiled. "People go missing every day, Semyonich. That's what the police are for. A whole bunch of freeloaders in their offices. What does that have to do with me?" He was about to hang up, to return to his only important reality at that moment. "He didn't just disappear, Ivan." Gromov's voice took on a strange, almost mystical tone. "He vanished. He disappeared into thin air. Do you understand? Right off the stage, in front of hundreds of people." Voron froze. He imagined the scene. The footlights, the velvet curtain, the applause, and a man who simply disappears. It was wrong. It violated all laws. Not only human laws, but natural laws as well. In his world, nothing disappeared without a trace. Everything left a trace. A falling leaf, melting snow, a dying animal. "Who is he?" asked Raven, not understanding why he had gotten involved in this conversation. "Nikolai Surov, the leading actor of our Northern Lights Theater. A star, a favorite of the public. He played the lead role in the premiere performance. In the final scene, he delivers a monologue, bows, and that's it. Emptiness. As if he had never been there." The Raven paused, trying to comprehend what he had heard. Theater, the city, an artificial world that he hated with all his soul. A world of false emotions, fake glamour, and rotten scenery. What could he do there? His methods, his intuition, his ability to read traces. All of this was useless on the parquet floor and among the velvet armchairs. There was no wind there that could carry the scent of the enemy. There was no ground where he could see a shoe print. "Semyonich, this isn't for me," he said firmly. "My methods won't work there. I look for traces on the ground, not in people's minds. Call in psychics, whoever you want. I'm needed here." He was sure that would end the conversation. But Gromov did not give up. "That's exactly why we need you, Ivan. Because all our methods have already failed. The forensic experts have sniffed every inch. They've questioned everyone they can. They've checked all the cameras. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's as if the man really turned into a ghost. You are the only one who sees the world differently. You're not looking for what should be, but for what shouldn't be. You're looking for a violation of order. And what happened here is the biggest violation of order I've seen in 30 years of service." Voron looked at the clearing again. He knew the poacher was close. This was his prey. Clear, real, tangible. And there, in the city, darkness, illusion, and trickery awaited him. And yet, vanished into thin air. That phrase wouldn't leave his head. It clung to him, stirred him up, challenged his whole being. There are no tricks in nature. Every phenomenon has a cause and a consequence. If a person disappeared, it means he left a trace. It's just that no one knows how to read it. And Raven suddenly realized that he would not be able to sleep peacefully until he solved this mystery. It was stronger than him. It was a challenge not to an investigator, but to a tracker. A challenge to his belief in the immutability of the laws of the universe. "All right," he said, surprised at his own decision. "I'll be there." In 2 days, he turned off his phone and put it in his backpack. He looked at Shadow. The dog tilted her head questioningly. "Sorry, friend," said Raven, scratching her behind the ear. "The hunt is off. We'll have to go down from the mountains. The asphalt is calling us." He stood up, brushed the pine needles off his clothes, and, without looking back, walked in the direction where his world ended and the world of humans began. The city greeted Ivan Belov with noise and stench. After 2 days of travel, first on foot and then on a passing logging truck, he found himself in a world that his body perceived as aggressive and hostile. The air, thick with exhaust fumes and dust, scratched his throat. The endless hum of cars, shouts, and snatches of music coming from open windows merged into a single cacophony that pressed on his eardrums. Accustomed to the subtle polyphony of the taiga, the shadow at his feet cringed, its ears pressed against its head, and its tail, usually held proudly, now hung down as if it had done something wrong. The dog, like its owner, felt like a stranger here, out of place. A detail from another, simpler and more honest world. They walked along asphalt sidewalks, and Voron felt the dead, impenetrable surface under his feet, which gave him no information, unlike the living, breathing earth of the forest, which told him the story of everyone who had walked on it. The Northern Lights Theatre towered over the grey city buildings like an old but still majestic cliff. The massive Stalinist Empire-style building, with its columns, stucco moldings, and huge blind windows, seemed like a portal to another reality. The closer they got, the stronger Raven felt the aura emanating from it. It was not just a building made of stone and concrete. It was a closed ecosystem, living by its own special laws. Entering through the heavy oak doors, he closed his eyes for a moment. His sense of smell, sharpened by years of living in the taiga, was assaulted by a hurricane of scents. The sweet, suffocating aroma of old velvet, mixed with acrid dust that seemed to have seeped into every crack. The smells of makeup, powder, hairspray. The faint, sour smell of human sweat, fear, and excitement. And above it all hovered the subtle, almost intangible scent of lies. It was the main component of the local air. They were met by Major Gromov. He looked tired, his face appearing grey under the dim light of the crystal chandeliers. "It's good that you came," he said, shaking Ivan's hand. "It's been dreary here without you. They're going around in circles like blind kittens." He nodded toward a group of people in uniform standing at the entrance to the auditorium. One of them stood out. A young, fit captain with a confident, slightly contemptuous expression on his face. "This is Captain Semyonov," Gromov introduced him. "He's in charge of the case. Very promising." Semyonov gave Voron a quick, appraising look, glancing at his faded storm jacket, hiking boots, and weather-beaten, tanned face, and a slight smile touched his lips. "Ah, a taiga tracker," he said, extending his hand more out of politeness than respect. "I've heard about you. They say you're on familiar terms with bears. I hope your methods will be useful here, although, you know, This isn't a forest. We deal with evidence and facts, not birdsong.
Voron silently shook his hand. He did not respond. It was pointless to argue with such people. They spoke different languages.
For Semyonov, the world consisted of protocols, expert reports, and evidence. For Voron, it consisted of tracks, signs, and disturbed equilibrium. At that moment, a woman flew out from behind the velvet curtain. She was tall and thin, wearing an expensive but slightly crumpled dress, with a mane of red hair that seemed to have a life of its own. Her face was pale, with dark circles under her eyes, but she carried herself with regal dignity. "Major, how much longer can this go on?" Her voice, apparently accustomed to giving orders, broke into hysterical notes. "The theater is waiting. Rehearsals have been disrupted. We have a premiere coming up, and you've turned this place into a circus with dogs." She looked at Shadow with undisguised disgust. This was Zoya Arkadyevna, the theater director, authoritative, accustomed to adoration, and completely lost in a situation that was spiraling out of her control. "This is Ivan Belov," Gromov said calmly. "I invited him for a consultation, and this is his assistant, Shadow." Zoya looked at Voron as if he were a piece of dirt that had been brought into her crystal palace. "A consultant? Are you kidding me?" "I need results, not consultants from the taiga. Find Kolya, and I'll make you rich. But if you just hang around here, I'll complain to the minister himself." Voron ignored her tirade. He wasn't looking at her, but through her. He was reading her like he reads an animal's tracks. He saw her fear, not for the missing actor, but for her reputation, for her small, perfectly constructed world, in which a crack had suddenly appeared. He saw her lies. She spoke of Surov with ostentatious despair, but deep in her eyes he noticed a cold, almost relieved calm. "I need to go on stage," he said, turning to Gromov. Semyonov snorted. "We've already turned everything over 3 times. Forensic experts crawled around with magnifying glasses. Nothing. But of course, you know better. They walked through the auditorium, which was plunged into semi-darkness. The rows of velvet seats resembled a frozen, silent army. The stage, flooded with cold, technical light, looked bare and defenseless. In the middle, right in the center, there was an open hatch. Perfectly clean, without a single scratch. Semyonov approached it. Here, the place of disappearance. According to eyewitnesses, he was standing right here. He delivered his final monologue, bowed. And that was it. He vanished. The hatch, as you can see, was closed. We opened it later. Underneath it is a normal technical room. A basement. No secret passages, no traces. He couldn't have fallen in there. Voron did not approach the hatch. He stopped at the edge of the stage, right at the ramp. He closed his eyes. Semyonov and Gromov exchanged surprised glances. Zoya snorted. Voron paid no attention to them. He did what he always did when he came to a new place. He listened. He inhaled. He sensed. He turned off his logic and turned on his instincts. He built a map of this place in his mind. Not a geographical one, but a sensory one. Here, on the left, there was a barely noticeable draft from a poorly covered curtain. From there came the smell of old paint and machine oil. On the right, from the auditorium, there was a smell of mothballs and perfume. From above, invisible dust fell from the grates, and its bitter taste settled on his tongue. He felt the vibration of old boards under his feet. He heard pipes humming somewhere deep in the basement. He wasn't looking for evidence. He was looking for an anomaly. A disruption in the natural order of things. In the forest, it might be an unnaturally broken branch or the absence of birds in a clearing. Here, everything was different, but the principle remained the same. He opened his eyes and slowly walked across the stage. He moved not like an investigator, but like a predator exploring new territory. He didn't look down at his feet for footprints. He looked at the big picture, at how the dust lay everywhere. It was an even, grey layer. But in one place, near the side curtain, the layer was slightly thinner, as if something had disturbed it. Not brushed away, but disturbed, as if something had fallen from above and immediately risen, creating a barely noticeable swirl of air. He walked over to that spot. He bent down. Semyonov watched him with open mockery. What? Looking for mushrooms? Or maybe a squirrel's nest? The raven didn't answer. He ran his fingers over the boards. They were dry and dusty, but in the air, right here, at this spot, he caught another scent. It was incredibly faint, almost gone, drowned out by dozens of other, stronger aromas. But his nose, trained to recognize thousands of natural scents, picked it out from the general chorus. It was the smell of dampness, not the stale dampness of a basement, but a living natural dampness, the smell of wet earth, rotting leaves, and moss. He straightened up and looked up at the frightening, dark height above the stage, where the ceiling was lost in a chaos of cables, beams, and spotlights. There was no earth there. There was no moss. But the smell was there. It came from there, and it was the very disturbance he was looking for. Descending the creaky metal ladder under the stage, they found themselves in a completely different world.
If the upper level was dominated by glitz, albeit fake, then here it was utilitarian, centuries-old grime that reigned supreme. A realm of shadows and dust.
The low vaulted ceilings were lost in the darkness. The air was stale, smelling of decay, old wood, and mice. Countless cables and wires snaked across the walls and ceiling, creating the feeling that they were inside some giant, dead organism. The only source of light was dim bulbs in metal shades, casting long, ugly shadows on everything. The shadow that had descended with Ivan behaved restlessly, whimpering quietly and cowering at his feet, its senses offended by this dead, lifeless space. Well, here you are. Admire it. Captain Semyonov spread his arms, and his voice echoed under the arches. Our underground. As you can see, nothing interesting. We illuminated every centimeter with ultraviolet light, tapped all the walls. Emptiness. No secret passages, no traces of a struggle. The forensic experts took fingerprints. Only ours, and those of the local workers. The conclusion is clear. He couldn't have disappeared from here. He spoke with the air of a man repeating the obvious to a slow-witted person for the 100th time. For him, this inspection was a mere formality, a concession to the old major's whim. Voron paid no attention to him. He walked slowly across the concrete floor, but looked not down, but up at the wooden floorboards of the stage above his head. He saw thin strips of light shining through the cracks between the boards. He listened to their footsteps and voices echoing off the walls, creating a bizarre echo.
He read this space not as a crime scene, but as an animal's lair. He tried to understand its logic, its hidden paths, its weak spots. He walked around the open manhole without even looking into it. It was an obvious trap for attention, bait that everyone else had fallen for. He was interested in something else.
Witnesses say that, before he disappeared, he looked at the side curtain, he said into the silence, his voice sounding unusually loud. To the left, Semenov smiled. Who knows where he was looking? Acting.
Maybe the script said he had to look there.
No, Voron replied evenly. He wasn't looking according to the script. It was an instinctive movement. That's how an animal looks when it senses danger, or notices something unusual in its territory. He wasn't looking at the scenery. He was looking at the threat, or at the way to safety. He headed for the part of the basement that was directly under the left wing. It was the darkest part, and the mountains of old, discarded props created a real maze. Gromov silently followed him. Semyonov sighed discontentedly and trailed behind, lighting his way with a flashlight on his phone.
What do you hope to find here? A sandwich someone forgot? He persisted.
Voron stopped.
He closed his eyes again, sniffing the air. Here, far from the main space, the smells were different. There was less dust, but more dampness coming from the old brick foundation.
It smelled of paint, glue, and something else chemical. He slowly moved along the wall, running his fingertips over its rough surface. He wasn't doing this to find a secret button, as Semyonov might have thought. He was simply gathering information about the temperature, the humidity, the structure of the material. Suddenly, his fingers stumbled upon something tiny, soft and damp, stuck to the brick at about human height. He stopped. He opened his eyes. In the dim light of the lamp, he couldn't make out what it was. He took his own powerful flashlight, which he always carried with him, out of his pocket, and shone it on the wall. Semyonov and Gromov came closer. On the old brick, covered with centuries of dirt, in a small hollow, lurked a tiny piece of something green, about the size of a pinky fingernail. Semyonov grunted in disappointment. Moss. Is that all? There must be tons of it in this basement. No, Raven said quietly, without taking his eyes off his discovery. There's no moss like this here. He carefully removed a tiny fragment with the tip of his hunting knife and placed it on a clean handkerchief. This moss doesn't grow in basements. It grows on rocks at high altitudes, where there is plenty of light and moisture. In the mountains, or on the roofs of very old buildings. He straightened up and shone his flashlight upward at the ceiling boards. It couldn't have grown here. It was brought here, and it was brought here recently. It hasn't had time to dry yet. Semyonov wanted to make another sarcastic remark, but kept quiet. There was such unwavering confidence in Voron's voice that even his skepticism cracked. They had found the first anomaly, the only object in the entire theater that was foreign to this ecosystem. We need to talk to the witnesses, Voron said, turning to Gromov. Everyone who was on stage or behind the scenes at that moment. Half an hour later, they were sitting in one of the dressing rooms. The room, reeking of powder and lacquer, was filled with people. Chorus singers, ballet dancers, stagehands. All of them had already given statements several times, and their faces showed signs of deadly fatigue. Semyonov conducted the interrogation by the book. Strictly, methodically, asking the same questions in different sequences, trying to catch someone in a lie. But everyone said the same thing. Yes, Suraf stood in the center. Yes, he delivered a monologue. Yes, he bowed and disappeared. It was shock, horror, bewilderment. Their testimony was smooth, polished by repeated repetition. Voron sat slightly to the side, in the corner, and didn't seem to be listening to what they were saying at all. Shadow lay at his feet, resting his muzzle on his paws, also watching the people intently. Ivan Belov did what he did best. He read the flock. He didn't listen to the words. Words are a shell, a way to hide the truth, not reveal it. He watched what was behind the words. He watched their body language, their darting eyes, the barely noticeable tremor in their hands. He breathed in their scent, a cocktail of fear, curiosity, and long-standing theatrical envy. He saw the aura of this group, a common field of panic and confusion. They were all scared, sincerely, truly scared. The disruption of order in their ecosystem had thrown them off balance. All except one. He sat in the far corner, almost in the shadows. A young guy, second cast, Surov's understudy. His name was Igor. He was the only one sitting completely still. He didn't fidget in his chair, fiddle with his clothes, or shift his gaze from one investigator to another. He was calm. Too calm. It was an unnatural, abnormal calmness. The same calmness his dog Tenny had when she was lying in wait. It was not the calmness of a detached observer, but of a predator who was in control of the situation. Voron noticed that when Semenov asked him questions, he answered briefly and to the point, but his eyes remained cold, and the pulse in his neck did not flutter once. The other actors were in shock over the disappearance of their leader. They had lost their leader, albeit an unloved one. Their world had been shaken. And this guy, he was like a wolf who had waited for the old leader to leave and was now ready to take his place. There was no grief in his calmness. There was anticipation. He didn't lie about the facts. Like everyone else, he saw Surov disappear. But he lied about the main thing, his emotions. His calmness was as foreign in this room full of fear as that piece of mountain moss in the dusty basement of the theater. Voron said nothing. He just noted the second anomaly to himself. Semenov's investigation was stalled, blocked by a lack of evidence. Raven's investigation was just beginning. He now had two threads, two clues that did not officially exist, and both of them led somewhere, far beyond this shiny, rotten box called a theater. The next day, Ivan Belov returned to the theater alone, without Gromov, and, even more so, without Semyonov. He needed to be alone with this place, to hear its true voice, not the buzz of the official investigation. He left the shadow in the Major's hotel room. There was no place for the dog here, its keen sense of smell driven mad by the cacophony of artificial smells and emotions. Raven did not enter through the front entrance, but through the service entrance, showing the sullen guard the ID card Gromov had given him. He did not go to the stage or the auditorium. His goal today was the burrow, that complex, confusing system of corridors, dressing rooms, warehouses, and workshops that made up the underside of this glittering world. Backstage, he moved slowly, aimlessly, like an animal exploring a forest that was new to him. To an outside observer, his actions might have seemed pointless.
He wasn't looking for clues in the traditional sense. He didn't look under tables or tap on walls.
He was reading the space. Here, in the narrow passage between the prop room and the costume room, the linoleum on the floor was worn away. It was worn unevenly, in a narrow path. This meant that people walked here often, but alone, hurriedly, trying to remain unnoticed. There was a small niche in the wall hidden behind an old screen. Inside, there are several cigarette butts on the floor and an empty cognac bottle, a secret place for rest, or for secret conversations. The air still carries the faint smell of expensive tobacco and cheap perfume. A man and a woman used to meet here. He used his taiga skills in this stone labyrinth. He identified the main trails, the routes that the staff used most often. He found the watering holes, places where people gathered to exchange news and gossip, like animals gathering at a stream. He looked for resting places, secluded corners where one could hide from everyone and be alone. He built in his mind not a map of the premises, but a map of the life of this theatrical anthill. And all this time he tried to superimpose the roots of one particular person on this map. Nikolai Surov. He went into his dressing room, which was now sealed, but Gromov gave him the key. Surov's dressing room was like a sanctuary dedicated to one god, himself. The walls were hung with photographs of him in various roles, posters, and framed rave reviews. The table was immaculately tidy, with expensive perfumes and luxury cosmetics. Everything screamed self-admiration and success. Semyonov and his team had, of course, turned everything upside down here, but they were looking for traces of the kidnapper. Voron was looking for traces of Surov himself. Traces of his real life, not his stage life. He sat down in his chair and closed his eyes. He breathed in the smell of the place, the smell of success mixed with the smell of fear. It was here, this subtle, sour smell. Surov was afraid of something. Raven began to methodically, inch by inch, examine the dressing room. Not as an investigator, but as a hunter, studying the lair of a predator. He noticed something that no one else had seen before him, an old, worn volume of Shakespeare lying on the shelf. The book was clearly out of place in this realm of glamour. Raven picked it up. It was heavy, bound in old leather. He opened it. The pages were yellowed but clean. He leafed through it to the end, and on the last, blank page, he saw a few lines written in pencil. They were not words, but numbers and short notes, similar to accounting records. Zoya, 50. Premiere. Light, 15. Tour. Choir, 20. Anniversary. It was a trace. Not the kind left on the ground, but the kind left in the soul and on paper. He looked at these numbers and realized he had found what he was looking for. It wasn't evidence in the legal sense, but it was evidence in his world. It was the key to understanding the ecosystem of this theater. Surov was not just the leader of the pack. He was its disease. He was a parasite that fed on its juices. The Raven put the book back in its place. Now he needed confirmation. He found the director, Zoya Arkadyevna, in her office. She was sitting at a massive desk, smoking a thin cigarette and talking on the phone, giving hysterical instructions to someone. When she saw Raven, she hung up the phone. Well, did you find my Kolya? Or did you come here to sniff dust again? Her voice was dripping with venom. Raven silently walked over to the desk
and placed the open Shakespeare book in front of her.
Zoya looked at the page with the numbers, and her face turned into a stone mask for a moment. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving ugly, pale patches. "What is this?" she hissed, even though she knew perfectly well what it was. "It's called blackmail," Raven said calmly. "He was collecting compromising information on you, on everyone, and he was extorting money. 50,000 from you for the premiere. And it seems it was always like that. Illegal cashing of funds through fake contracts. Fake gold from your theater." Zoya jumped up. Her eyes flashed with lightning. "How dare you? This is slander. I'll call security." "You won't," Voron replied just as calmly. "Because you know it's true. Surov was a sick specimen who poisoned your entire ecosystem. He ruined your cozy little world where you were all used to living by your own rules. He was a cancerous tumor, and you all wanted to get rid of him."
Zoya sank into her chair. Her posture, her face, everything spoke of defeat. She stubbed out her cigarette in the ashtray with such force that it looked as if she wanted to crush someone's head.
"He was a genius," she said in a hollow, lifeless voice. "But he was a monster. He knew all our secrets. He knew who was sleeping with whom, who was stealing props, who was drinking before going on stage. And he knew about our financial affairs. He kept us all on a tight leash. We hated him, all of us, but we also feared him.
He was our king and our executioner at the same time. Now the picture was becoming clear. The motive did not belong to one person.
The motive belonged to the entire troupe. It was not a murder motivated by jealousy or revenge. It was a collective desire to restore balance, to get rid of the tyrant who was preventing them from living. They all had an interest in his disappearance, but someone had to muster the courage and carry out the sentence. Someone who not only hated Surov, but who also possessed sufficient courage, composure, and, most importantly, the skills to carry out such a complex, almost mystical plan. Voron left the director's office. He walked through the empty, echoing corridors of the theater and felt how the atmosphere had changed. Before, he had felt only lies and fear here. Now, he also felt relief, the relief of hunted animals who had finally gotten rid of the predator that had kept the entire forest in fear. He stopped at the board with photos of the actors. Dozens of faces looked at him, smiling, tragic, comical. Masks, and behind each mask was a person with a motive. Any one of them could have been the one who pulled the trigger. But his intuition told him that he shouldn't be looking here. The criminal was not from this pack. He was an outsider, just like himself. A man who had come from outside to restore order. Leaving behind the world of fake gold and dressing rooms steeped in lies, Ivan Belov returned to his starting point. The stage. He already knew the motive, or rather, the collective desire that hung in the air of the theater. He felt the relief of the troupe, freed from their tyrant. But this was only knowledge about the soil, the fertile ground in which the crime could grow. The sower himself, the one who carried out the sentence, remained a shadow. And Voron's intuition told him that this shadow did not come from this musty, artificial world. He stood in the middle of the empty stage, and the silence pressed on his ears. He called again, the only witness he trusted. He returned to the hotel and brought the shadow. As soon as the Laika stepped onto the wooden floor, she was transformed.
The anxiety she had felt in the basement and corridors was replaced by extreme concentration.
She froze, her nose pointing upward, her nostrils quivering as she read the millions of invisible particles floating in the air. She was a living, hypersensitive instrument that could distinguish truth from lies at the molecular level. Semenov and his forensic team were looking for clues here, on the horizontal plane. They examined every inch of the floor, looked into the hatch, checked the wings. They were thinking in 2 dimensions. But the theater, like the taiga, was 3-dimensional. It had not only width and length, but also height. Ignoring the center of the stage, where Surov was last seen, the shadow slowly moved to the left wing, the very place where, according to Voron, the actor had cast his last instinctive glance. The dog walked around the massive velvet curtain and froze against the wall. She raised her head, and her quiet, questioning whimper was more eloquent than any words. She had found a trail. But the trail did not lead to the side or down. It led upward. Ivan walked over and stood next to her. He looked where the dog was looking, up, into the dim light where some technical structures were lost under the ceiling. He saw nothing unusual, but he trusted Tenny's instincts more than his own eyes. He took out his powerful flashlight and directed the beam upward. Dust that had accumulated over decades swirled in the beam like a snowstorm. The light revealed a tangle of old, rust-covered beams, cables, locks, and counterweights. These were the flybars, the technical heart of the stage, hidden from the audience's view. From there, above, came the scenery, the lights, the sound. From there, the magic of the theater could be controlled. And, perhaps, from there, the disappearance of a person was also controlled. Ivan noticed a small, almost invisible service door in the wall, a little way from the wings. The door was unlocked. Behind it was a narrow, steep spiral staircase leading into the darkness. The air here was even more stifling, smelling of old metal and pigeon droppings. The shadow stepped confidently onto the first step. Raven followed her. They climbed higher and higher, each step echoing hollowly in the narrow stairwell. They passed several technical floors, galleries with spotlights, platforms for stagehands. The air smelled of ozone from powerful lamps and machine oil. But the shadow did not stop. She led him further to a place where there were no longer any signs of human activity. Finally, they found themselves at the very top, on a rickety wooden platform suspended directly above the stage. Below, in the dizzying void, it seemed tiny, like a toy. Here, under the roof itself, there was almost complete silence, broken only by the quiet hum of ventilation and the creaking of old beams. The dust lay so thick that their footsteps left clear prints, as if on freshly fallen snow. And here, in this dust, Raven saw something that made his heart beat faster. Footprints. Not his or Shadow's. Someone else's. They were the prints of heavy army boots. The footprints were clear and confident. The person who left them knew what they were doing. They moved, not like a theater worker, but like a climber or rock climber. Economically, placing their feet precisely, shifting their body weight. The tracks led from the stairs to the very center of the grates, to the spot directly above where Surov had disappeared. And here they ended. Voron lay on his stomach and shone his flashlight down into the gaps between the boards. He saw something he couldn't see from below. One of the cables leading to the winch was newer and cleaner than the others. It was stretched, tight as a string.
The disappearance was vertical.
It was the only correct, logical version that explained everything. Surov had not been kidnapped in the traditional sense. He had simply been lifted. Lifted up into the sky above the theater. Quickly, quietly, and efficiently. The person who performed this feat must have possessed extraordinary strength and, most importantly, special skills. None of the pampered actors or heavy stagehands could have done it. It was done by a professional. The raven followed the tracks further. They led from the center of the grates to an old, abandoned ventilation shaft that ran through the entire thickness of the building. The grate covering the entrance to the shaft had been removed and neatly leaned against the wall. The shadow froze at the dark opening, growling softly. Surov's scent was here, and it was strong. The criminal had dragged his victim through the ventilation system, like a predator, dragging its prey into its lair. Ivan shone his flashlight deep into the shaft. The walls were covered with centuries-old dirt, but he saw fresh scratches on it, marks from boots and, possibly, from a body that had been dragged through here. He was about to walk away when the beam of his flashlight caught something glinting on the floor in the darkness, right at the entrance to the shaft. He bent down. It was a small metal object, half hidden in the dust. He picked it up and brushed off the dirt. In his hand lay an old, worn buckle, made of some dull alloy. It was not a buckle from a belt or a theater costume. Raven recognized it immediately. Such homemade, reinforced buckles were used in old mountaineering and mountain rescue harnesses. They were made by hand, to order, for reliability. They were stronger and more durable than any factory-made equipment. He held the key in his hand, not just a piece of evidence, but the key to the whole mystery. This buckle was as foreign an object in this theater as a piece of mountain moss. It was something from another world. From his world. The world of the taiga. Mountains, rocks, and people who live by different laws. Now he knew for sure. The criminal was not just an outsider. He was one of those whom Raven knew best. A man for whom height was work and risk was life. He was a tracker, a hunter, a survivor. Just like him. And that meant the investigation had finally left the city limits. The hunt was on. And in this hunt, they were two equal predators. Major Gromov sat in his smoke-filled office, littered with folders and reports, and stared in bewilderment at the small, unassuming piece of metal lying on the table in front of him. Ivan Belov sat silently opposite him, his face as inscrutable as a rock. He offered no explanation, simply placed the buckle on the table and waited. For Gromov, a man of asphalt and protocols, it was just trash, a strange piece of metal found in the dust. He saw it only as material evidence that needed to be packed in a bag, sealed, and attached to the case file. For Voron, however, it was a chronicle carved in stone, a story told without words. And what does that give us? Gromov finally broke the silence, moving the buckle with the tip of his pen. It's not factory-made, Ivan replied curtly. His voice was even, but there were notes in it that the major had learned to recognize. Notes of restrained tension, like a beast that had picked up a scent. It's handmade, artisanal, but very high quality. Made to last for centuries. Gromov took the buckle in his hands and weighed it in his palm. The metal was cold and heavy. He squinted, examining the small scratches and scuffs on its surface. Mountaineering equipment, you said. Maybe some tourist dropped it? Or a stagehand who enjoys rock climbing in his spare time? No, Voron snapped. A stagehand would buy himself a beautiful, shiny buckle in a store. A light one, made of modern alloy. But this is a tool. Things like this aren't made for beauty or hobbies. They're made for survival. When your life and the life of the person you're saving depend on this piece of metal, you won't trust something stamped out on an assembly line. He took the buckle from the major's hands and turned it in a certain way. On the inside, in a place protected from friction, there was a tiny, almost faded engraving. 2 crossed pickaxes and the letter A. That's the craftsman's mark. His personal sign. Gromov frowned. He walked over to an old metal cabinet filled with archival files and rummaged through it for a long time, muttering something under his breath. Finally, he pulled out a thin yellowed folder labeled Mountain Rescue Service, Emergency Situations, 1980s, 90s. He blew the dust off it and placed it on the table. A long time ago, before all these EMACOM and other newfangled structures, we had our own, almost semi-legal mountain rescue team in our region. Volunteers, former climbers, geologists, hunters. The best of the best. They took on the most hopeless cases when the official services gave up. They worked purely out of enthusiasm, and they had the appropriate equipment. They made a lot of it themselves. They had their own craftsmen, their own secrets. He opened the folder. Inside were old black and white photographs of stern, weather-beaten faces, diagrams of homemade equipment, handwritten reports. And in one of the photographs, where a group of rescuers stood against the backdrop of a snow-covered peak, Voron saw it. The equipment. Exactly the same harness system, with exactly the same buckle. Gromov pointed to the photograph. Here they are, legends. Most of them are no longer alive. They crashed, froze to death, drank themselves to death. Their time is gone. But I remember the brand. It's the work of Anatoly Snegorev, the best equipment specialist in the unit. He could make something out of a tin can and a piece of wire that could hold a ton. At the sound of that name, something stirred deep within Ivan's soul. He didn't know Snegorev personally, but he knew that type of person. He was one of them, and suddenly, with blinding clarity, he understood everything. It wasn't just a crime. It was a message, intended for him, personally. An image that he had long buried under layers of years and taiga winters came to mind. The image of his friend, his partner on many expeditions, Anatoly Krotov. Tolik. They weren't in that old squad. They were younger. But they were their heirs, their disciples. They had adopted their philosophy, their code of honor. Anatoly was the best rock climber Ivan had ever known. He moved along the sheer wall with the grace of a predator, feeling the rock as if it were a living creature. And he was an idealist, a cruel, uncompromising idealist. He despised the city, considering it a rotten swamp, a place where it was not the strongest who survived, but the most cunning. He believed only in the laws of nature. A diseased tree must be cut down to save the forest. A weak fawn becomes prey to a wolf, and in this, there is supreme justice. The raven remembered their last conversation, many years ago, by a campfire high in the mountains. They had just completed a difficult rescue operation,
pulling a wealthy tourist who had climbed the mountain drunk out of a crevasse.
Instead of gratitude, the tourist threatened to sue them for his torn jacket. That evening, Anatoly was gloomier than the clouds. "You see, Van," he said then, staring into the fire. "We rescue rot. We upset the balance. We pull a sick sheep from the wolf's jaws, and it returns to the flock to infect the rest. Sometimes it seems to me that a real rescuer should not rescue, but judge, to administer justice, according to the law of the taiga." Ivan did not attach much importance to his words at the time, attributing them to fatigue and anger. But now, those words sounded like a sentence in his head. He looked at the buckle in his hands. Anatoly Krotov,
Tolya Skala, as he was called. He disappeared several years ago. He said he was going free hunting and vanished. No one knew where he was or what had happened to him. And now he was back to pass his own judgment.
Now Voron understood his logic. Surov, with his blackmail, debauchery, and parasitism, was for Anatoly that very sick tree. The theater was the infected forest, and he, Anatoly, was the sanitary worker. He did not consider himself a murderer or a kidnapper.
He considered himself an instrument of higher justice. He did not simply remove Surov, he removed him, just as a poacher removes a diseased animal from nature. Ivan stood up. "Thank you, Major," he said. Gromov looked up at him in surprise.
"Did you understand something?" "I understood everything," replied Voron. He didn't explain anything to Gromov. He wouldn't have understood. It was too personal. It was a duel, a challenge thrown down to him by a man from his past. Anatoly knew that sooner or later, it would be Voron who would track him down. He left that buckle behind on purpose, like a hunter leaves a mark on a tree to mark his territory. He wanted to be found by his equal, someone who would understand his motives, someone who could judge him not by city laws, but by the laws of the taiga. The investigation was over for Ivan Belov. The hunt for the ghost was beginning. Understanding who his opponent was did not bring Ivan Belov closer to solving the mystery. On the contrary, it distanced him from it. Now he knew the name and face of the ghost, Anatoly Krotov. He knew his handwriting, his philosophy, but he did not know the most important thing, where to look for him and, most importantly, where he was hiding Surova. Anatoly, like an experienced predator, would not leave a direct trail leading to his lair. He had disappeared, and the only way to find him was to understand his victim. The raven had to get inside Surov's head, read his thoughts, his fears, his secret hopes. And for that, he needed someone who saw the actor not as a monster or a genius, but simply as a human being. His search led him to the quietest and oldest part of the theater, to a small room under the roof, crammed with sheet music, dusty busts of composers, and old posters. Here, far from the intrigues and bustle, lived old Semyon Markovich, the theater's longtime composer and arranger. He was a living legend, a man who wrote music for productions even before most of the current actors were born. He was a recluse who rarely left his refuge, communicating with the world only through music. Everyone in the theater respected him, but they also feared him, considering him an unsociable eccentric. But Voron, studying Surov's surroundings, stumbled upon one strange detail. In the actor's schedule, among rehearsals, meetings, and banquets,
There was a short note once a week. S.M. No one could explain what it meant. Voron knocked on the felt-covered door. After a long pause, a creaky old voice said, "Come in." Ivan entered. The room was plunged into semi-darkness, the only light coming from an old lamp with a green shade standing on the piano. Behind the piano sat a thin, hunched old man with a shock of gray hair and a face covered with wrinkles like an old map. He did not turn around, his fingers continuing to move slowly and uncertainly across the keys, drawing a quiet, sad melody from the instrument. "If you're from the police, you're wasting your time," he said, without looking up from his playing. "I haven't seen or heard anything. All I hear is music." Ivan did not show his ID or ask any routine questions. He silently approached and sat down in an old, worn-out armchair in the corner. He just listened. The melody was simple, but it contained so much anguish and loneliness that Voron's heart sank for a moment. He felt that this music was the old man's soul, his only way of communicating with the world. When the last note faded away, dissolving into the dusty air, the old man finally turned around. His eyes, faded but surprisingly clear, studied Ivan intently. "You're not like them," he said. "Like whom?" asked Voron. "Like those. People in suits. They come, ask stupid questions, and leave. They look for traces on the floor. That traces should be sought in the soul." "That's why I came," Ivan said quietly. "I want to understand who Nikolai Surov was." The old man smiled. "Who was he?"
He was a storm. He was fire. He was a force of nature that burned everything in its path, and first and foremost, himself. They all saw him as nothing more than a tyrant, a blackmailer. They hated and feared him.
Only I knew that inside this monster lived a small, frightened boy who feared silence more than anything else in the world. Voron realized he had found what he was looking for. "Were you his friend?" "Friend? No. He had no friends. I was his confessor. Once a week, he would come here, sit in this very chair, and remain silent. And I would play. I would play for him. That was our conversation. He didn't come for the music. He came for the silence, which I filled with sound. He was afraid to be alone with his thoughts." "What did he think about?" asked Voron. "About the past. It wouldn't let him go. He was from these parts, from a small village in the foothills. He escaped from there, conquered the capital, became a star, but he could never escape from himself. He often remembered his only childhood friend, the boy with whom they climbed rocks and walked in the taiga together. He said he was the only person who understood him, a person who lived by real laws, not by the lies of the city." The raven listened, holding his breath. Each word of the old man was a missing piece of the mosaic. Sometimes, when things were particularly difficult for him, he would ask me to play a certain melody, a strange, wild melody, not theatrical at all. He said it was their secret signal, a signal they had invented when they were children. The composer turned to the piano, and his fingers touched the keys again. But this time, a completely different music poured out from under them. It was a short, disturbing motif, based on just a few notes, but there was something primitive about it, like the cry of a bird in a night forest. The melody was both a call and a warning. "This is a motif from an old local song," said Semyon Markovich when he finished playing. "It's a legend about the spirit of the taiga, a song about how the forest is a living organism, and if a diseased tree grows in it, poisoning the earth with its roots and preventing others from growing, the spirit sends his woodcutter to cut it down, not out of malice, but to save the whole forest." Voron stood up. Now he could see the whole picture. Surov's disappearance was not a kidnapping. It was a staged event, a cruel but brilliantly staged performance. Surov knew that Anatoly was following him. Perhaps he even called him himself. He was sick. He had poisoned his own life and the lives of everyone around him. And, as in the old legend, he called the woodcutter to end his suffering. But he wanted to be found. Not by the police, not by Semyonov with his reports. He wanted to be found by the only friend from his past who would understand his actions. His disappearance from the scene, the mystical effect, the absence of traces, all this was a signal, an encrypted message that only one person could read: Anatoly. But Anatoly, in turn, leaving the buckle behind, forwarded the message on. To him, Voron. It was a chain of signals, a game started by two desperate people from another world. And now he, Ivan Belov, found himself at the very center of it. He was not just an investigator. He was the judge that both the victim and the executioner had chosen for their final act. The music was still ringing in Ivan Belov's ears when he left the old composer's room. The disturbing, wild melody, like the cry of a night bird, became the key for him. But this key did not open the door that ordinary investigators were looking for. It opened the door to a plan, to a brilliantly staged performance. The raven descended from the roof of the theater. And now, this world of lies and spotlight looked different to him. He was no longer looking for the kidnapper. He was looking for the director. The realization that Surov's disappearance was staged presented him with a new, even more difficult question. How? How did one person, even someone as experienced as Anatoly Krotov, manage to create the illusion of mystically disappearing into thin air? Lifting the actor upstairs with climbing equipment was only half the trick, the mechanical part. But how did he deceive the ears of dozens of witnesses? How did he make them believe that Surov's voice had melted away, leaving only a ringing echo behind? This deception was the essence of the whole plan. Anatoly didn't just physically remove Surov from the stage. He psychologically convinced everyone of his supernatural disappearance, turning the crime into a legend, a theatrical myth. This was done to confuse the police, to make them look for something supernatural where there was only cold calculation. Voron realized that the answer was not to be found in the testimony of witnesses, but in the victim's own belongings. Surov was not just a victim. He was an accomplice, the main actor in this final performance. This meant that somewhere in his personal belongings there had to be a score for this performance. He headed back to Nikolai's dressing room. Now he looked at it with different eyes.
He was looking not for traces of a struggle or fingerprints, but for traces of preparation. He methodically went through the papers on the table, personal notes, scripts.
His attention was drawn to an old, worn notebook in a leather binding, which he had seen before but had not paid any attention to. It was filled with notes on roles, quotes, and some everyday calculations. But between the pages devoted to Hamlet, there was a sheet of paper neatly folded in four. Ivan unfolded it. It was not a stage layout or a set design. It was a complex technical diagram drawn by hand in pencil. In the center was a schematic representation of the stage of the Northern Lights Theatre. But thin winding lines ran across the entire plan, connecting certain points on the floor with a rectangle labeled Control Panel off to the side. It looked like a diagram of electrical wiring or an acoustic system. Voron immediately realized that he had found what he was looking for. This was the score of the illusion. With this diagram in his hands, he returned to the empty, echoing stage. Now he was looking not at the big picture, but at the details, at the floor beneath his feet. He stood in the center, in the very spot where Surov had last been seen, and began to compare the diagram with reality. On the diagram, 3 lines diverged from this central point, leading to the edges of the stage. Voron knelt down and began to carefully examine the old, black-painted boards. His fingers, accustomed to reading the relief of rocks and tree bark, slid over the surface, and he found them. 3 barely noticeable, almost invisible cracks in the floor, disguised as natural joints between the boards. They were no wider than a knife blade. He took out his knife and carefully pried up the edge of one of the cracks. Underneath was a narrow channel, and in it was a thin, almost invisible wire in black braiding. It had been laid with incredible precision. Raven followed the entire length of the wire, and it led him to a small round hole, hidden in the shadows at the very edge of the baseboard. The hole looked like a socket for a microphone plug. On the diagram, this spot was marked as Microphone 1.
Now everything was falling into place. A system of hidden microphones was concealed under the stage. But for what purpose?
According to the diagram, the wires from the microphones led toward the wings and further into the labyrinth of backstage rooms. Ivan, like a tracker following an animal's trail, followed this invisible wire. It led him to the farthest, most cluttered part of the theater, the prop workshop. It was a realm of dust, papier-mâché, and dried paint. Here were stored the sets from long-forgotten plays, cardboard castles, plastic trees, dragon heads, and antique furniture. In the farthest corner, buried under old backdrops and mountains of rags, it stood, an old, bulky wooden box, resembling an army radio station. It was the very same control panel from the diagram. It was clearly not of theatrical origin. There were no standard buttons or switches on its metal panel. Instead, there were several homemade toggle switches and large round controls with hand-scratched inscriptions. Echo, reverberation, phase shift, frequency. The very same wires coming from the stage were connected to the back of the console. Voron immediately understood what he was looking at. It was a homemade, but obviously very powerful, acoustic device. A sound mixer designed not to improve sound, but to distort it. Ivan imagined the scene that evening. Surov stands on stage, below him, hidden in the floor.
are three-directional microphones that pick up his every word, every breath. The signal from the microphones travels through invisible wires to this console where Anatoly sits. At the right moment, when the cable is already taut and ready to lift the actor up, Anatoly turns the controls, and Surov's last scream, amplified and processed by this infernal machine, turns into something inhuman. The dissolving effect that the witnesses talked about was a complex acoustic trick. The phase shift created the sensation that the sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The reverberation turned a short cry into a long, fading echo, and the smooth change in frequency created the illusion that the source of the sound was moving away at incredible speed, as if falling into another reality. Voron stood in front of the silent console, overcome by a strange feeling, a mixture of admiration and horror. He was faced with a reversal of concepts. Anatoly didn't just kill or kidnap a person. He created a work of art, gloomy, cruel, but brilliant in its own way. He had deceived not the eyes, but the ears. He had played on the most subtle and vulnerable human sense, turning everyone present from witnesses to a crime into spectators of a mystical performance. He had replaced reality with illusion. This made his opponent even more dangerous and unpredictable. Anatoly was not just an obsessed idealist passing judgment. He was a calculating and cold-blooded director, a psychologist who knew how to pull the strings of human perception. He played his game on a completely different level. And to win this game, Ivan Bielov had to stop thinking like an investigator and a hunter. He had to learn to think like an illusionist. He had to find that one key trick, that one simple and cruel truth that Anatoly had so skillfully hidden behind this curtain of sound and light. Ivan Belov stood in the empty prop room, and the silence weighed on him like heavy, unfallen rain. He had found the invisible wires, solved the mystery of the acoustic control panel, and understood how the illusion had been created. He knew how. He knew who was the chief director, Anatoly Krotov. But this flawless plan was missing one crucial element. Anatoly was a stranger in this world, a man of the mountains and taiga. He couldn't have known all the inner workings of the theater, all the secret paths and schedules. He couldn't install complex equipment, lay wires, and control everything from the heart of the backstage area on his own, without attracting attention. He needed an assistant, someone from the inside, a shadow that moved unnoticed among other shadows. And Ivan's memory, honed by years of tracking, helpfully provided him with an image. The first day of the investigation. Dozens of frightened, confused, hysterical faces. The choir, the ballet, the actors. They were all like a flock of birds struck by lightning. All except one. One person who was too quiet, too inconspicuous in the chaos. Igor Verasov, Surov's eternal understudy, the one who stood in the shadow of genius, always ready to step in, but never getting the lead role. That day, his calmness seemed strange and unnatural to Ivan. It was not the calmness of a person in shock, but of a person who knew the script. Just as his dog's shadow freezes before rushing off on a trail, Igor froze in anticipation, waiting for the storm to pass. Voron found him in a small, shared dressing room, which he shared with 3 other supporting actors. Igor sat in front of the mirror, but he wasn't putting on makeup. He just stared at his reflection with a tired, empty gaze. He wasn't surprised by Ivan's arrival. It seemed as if he had been waiting for him. Voron did not sit down. He walked over and stood behind him, so that both of them were reflected in the mirror, the tall, stern tracker and the pale, exhausted actor. They were silent for several long minutes, and this silence was more tense than any interrogation.
"There is a law in the taiga," Ivan finally said, his voice quiet, but each word weighing like a stone. "If a diseased tree takes root in the forest, it begins to poison the ground around it.
It takes the sun away from the young shoots, its rotten roots infecting the healthy trees, and then the forest begins to die. And to save the whole forest, sometimes someone has to become a woodcutter, take up an axe, and do what others dare not do." He was not speaking as an investigator. He was speaking as a man who knows what order is and what chaos is. He was speaking the language of Anatolia. And he saw Igor's shoulders tremble in the mirror.
"He was a genius," Igor said hoarsely, not taking his eyes off his reflection. "But he was rotten. He turned our theater, our home, into a poisonous swamp. He humiliated us, broke us, made us crawl. He enjoyed his power. He was that very sick tree, and no one dared to cut it down."
As he spoke, with each word, the mask of indifference fell from his face, revealing deeply hidden pain and hatred. "I'm not a murderer, and Anatoly is not a murderer. We are orderlies."
We were just restoring balance. Now there was no doubt. The raven had found his man. You helped him. It was not a question, but a statement. You brought him here. You showed him all the ins and outs. You helped set up the equipment.
And that evening, while he was upstairs on the grates and in the fake control room, you were downstairs. You controlled the panic. You created an illusion. Igor smiled bitterly. An illusion. Our whole life here is an illusion. I just put on another show, the most honest show of my life. I distracted their attention, directed their gaze, prompted the right emotions. I was the director of their fear. It wasn't difficult. They were used to playing what they were told. He confessed everything, calmly, methodically, as if reading a script. He told how Anatoly had found him, how they had spent months preparing this plan.
Igor considered Anatoly not a criminal, but a savior, a man from another, real world, who had come to cleanse their false world of filth. He spoke of him with reverence, almost with religious awe, but when he finished his story, Ivan realized that this was not the end. He felt that Igor was still keeping the most important, most terrible truth to himself.
"Why did he leave the buckle?" asked Voron. "Why did he leave a trail that led straight to him? He could have disappeared without a trace, along with Surov. No one would ever have found him." Igor was silent for a long time. He looked away from the mirror and stared at his hands resting on the table.
"Because Surov wasn't the target,"
he finally said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Voron froze. The air in the dressing room suddenly became thick and difficult to breathe.
"He was bait,"
Igor continued, raising his eyes to Ivan. There was no longer any fear in them. There was a kind of grim, tragic certainty. All of this
This whole performance,
was staged for one audience member. For you, Ivan Nikolaevich. The blood drained from Voron's face. He felt the ground slipping away from under his feet. He looked at Igor and couldn't believe his ears.
Anatoly knew that the city police would get bogged down in this case, that they would look for mysticism, kidnappers, anything. He knew that sooner or later they would call you. The only person capable of reading his tracks. He didn't just want to get rid of Surov. He wanted you to see why Surov had to be eliminated. He wanted you to go through all this, see all this rot, and pass your verdict.
Igor's voice sounded like an echo in an empty well.
He doesn't trust city law. He considers it weak and deceitful. He believes in only one law, the law of the taiga. And he believes that you are his only true judge, the highest judge. He didn't kill Surov. He's waiting for your decision.
He has given you a choice. He wants you to decide who is right in this story. Him or this whole rotten world. Ivan recoiled from the mirror. He felt as if he had been punched in the gut. The entire investigation, all his searches, all his confrontation with this artificial world, it was all part of someone else's diabolical plan. He wasn't a hunter. He was a puppet, being pulled by strings.
He was the main character in a play written by his old friend, his ghost from the past. And now he had to play the last final act. He had to find Anatoly, but not to arrest him, to pass his own sentence.
Major Gromov's office had been turned into both a headquarters and a military council.
The air was thick with tobacco smoke. Cold coffee cups stood on the table, and red flags marked key points in the investigation on a large map of the city, spread out over the papers.
But Ivan Belov's gaze was not fixed on the map of the city, but on the window, beyond which the gray cityscape seemed alien and hostile to him.
He held two objects in his hands, a tiny, almost decayed piece of moss in a glass flask, and an old, faded photograph that Gromov had taken from the archives. The photograph showed two young men in hiking clothes against the backdrop of snow-capped mountains. One of them was himself, Ivan, 20 years ago. The other was Anatoly Versailles, his friend, his partner, his shadow.
So it's him, Gromov said, breaking the prolonged silence. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. The major sank heavily into his chair and rubbed his tired eyes.
All his urban office logic collapsed in the face of this taiga, irrational truth. Anatoly Versailles, former member of the mountain rescue team, resigned 10 years ago after an incident on the pass, lost a group of tourists due to an avalanche.
Officially, it was an accident. Unofficially, he blamed himself. He said they were the weak link, that nature had cleansed itself of them. After that, he withdrew into himself, worked in some forestry enterprise, then disappeared altogether.
No family, no address, a ghost. Ivan was silent. He looked at the photo, and the past came alive before him. He remembered Anatoly, not just as a colleague. They were more than friends. They were two halves of a whole.
Ivan was intuition, insight, animal instinct. Anatoly was logic, strength, unyielding will. He believed in order, absolute natural order, where there was no place for weakness, lies, or corruption.
He was an idealist who took his ideals to a dangerous, fanatical extreme. And the incident at the pass apparently broke something important in him, turning his belief in justice into an obsession with purity. He imagined himself a judge,
A taiga judge who had come to the city to uproot the diseased tree. It all fits together, Gromov continued, laying out the facts on the table like a solitaire game. The skills of a climber to lift Surov onto the grates,
knowledge of psychology, to create an illusion and confuse us. Idealism to do such a thing for the sake of an idea, not for money. And a connection with Surov. They had known each other since childhood, from the same village.
He was the friend the composer had mentioned, and the signal, cut down the diseased tree, was not meant for us, but for him. Surov himself called his executioner. But the main question remained. Why?
Why did Anatoly need this complicated theatrical performance? Why did he drag Ivan into it? The answer came by itself. Simple and terrifying in its logic. It wasn't a hunt for Surov, Voron said quietly, and Gromov shuddered at his voice.
Surov was just bait. The target was me. The major stared at him in confusion. Anatoly knew that sooner or later you would call me, Ivan continued, looking at Gromov. He knew that only I could unravel his tracks. He didn't just kidnap Surov. He challenged me. He believed that only I, his old friend, his brother of the taiga, have the right to judge him. He staged this spectacle to prove to me that he was right, so that I would see the corruption of this world and take his side. It was a twisted, monstrous game, a duel between two worldviews, two truths. And the battlefield was not to be the theater, not the city, but their real home, the taiga. Now everything fell into place. The perfectly clean hatch, the vertical abduction, the signal. It was all part of a message that only one person could read. But where should we look for them? Gromov traced his hand across the city map. He could have taken him anywhere. Ivan slowly placed the photograph on the table and picked up the flask with moss. He left us a map, he said. We just weren't looking in the right place. He poured the tiny dried fragment onto a sheet of white paper. The moss was dark green, almost black, with silvery streaks. This isn't just moss, said Raven. It's cladonia, a rare type of lichen. It only grows in certain conditions. At high altitudes, on old, rocky slopes where there is almost no soil. And I know only one such place. He walked over to a large map of the region hanging on the office wall. His finger found the Sayan mountain range and then slowly crept northward to the old, abandoned foothills. The abandoned Krasny Kamny forestry, he said. Anatoly and I served there together when we were just starting out. That was our first base, our first winter camp. The locals called it Witch's Bald Spot. Nothing grows there, except this lichen. Now they had more than just a suspect. They had a root. Anatoly didn't kill Surov. At least, not right away. In his twisted code of honor, murder is a last resort. He removed Surov, like a sick individual, to isolate him from the healthy forest. And he's keeping him there, in their old, secret winter camp. He's waiting for Ivan. The case had finally gone beyond the city's jurisdiction. Now it was a personal story, a personal hunt. Gromov understood this. He looked at Ivan, at his focused face, which had suddenly become wild again, like the taiga. Are you going alone? He asked.
Yes, with Shadow, replied Voron. Siemenov and his squad will be useless there. They'll leave too many traces. They'll scare him.
And I have to approach quietly. This was no longer a conversation between an investigator and a consultant. It was a conversation between two old friends who understood each other without words. Gromov nodded. I'll give you everything you need. Communications, weapons, transport to the foothills. But from there on, you're on your own. And be careful, Ivan. He may have been your friend in the past, but now he's a predator. Hunted, but all the more dangerous for it. Voron said nothing. He was already gone. His thoughts were there, in the mountains, on the snow-covered trails. He was already mapping out a route in his mind, calculating Anatoly's steps, his possible mistakes. The investigation in the city was complete. Now the real work began, the hunt, in which he was both investigator and former friend, and the same predator following the trail. He had to restore order, but not the kind prescribed by the criminal code, rather the ancient, natural law of balance that his old friend had violated. The old rattling UAZ that Gromov had given them stopped at the edge of the forest, where the paved road turned into a barely visible dirt road and died, swallowed up by the advancing taiga. The car could go no further. Beyond that lay a territory governed by different laws. Captain Semenov, whom the major had nevertheless forced to accompany them to their destination, got out from behind the wheel and looked at the wall of centuries-old pine trees with undisguised disgust. For him, a man of asphalt and concrete, this forest was a foreign, hostile world, the complete opposite of the familiar and orderly urban environment. He looked at Ivan, who was silently taking his backpack out of the trunk, and his gaze revealed a mixture of contempt and bewilderment. He still didn't believe in this taiga magic, considering it all to be the ravings of an old tracker. Ivan paid no attention to him. He moved smoothly, economically, without a single unnecessary movement. The hustle and bustle of the city, the nervousness, the fatigue, all of it fell away from him like old, useless skin. He was transforming before our eyes. His shoulders straightened, his gaze became sharp and predatory, like that of a hawk. He was no longer the strange consultant who was reluctantly tolerated at the police station. He was becoming who he really was, a crow, the master of this forest. He checked the fastenings on his backpack and adjusted the old, worn rifle on his back. Shadow sat next to him, tongue hanging out. Laika also sensed the change. She was no longer a timid, frightened creature lost in the maze of city smells. Her ears were pricked up, her nostrils quivering, catching thousands of forest scents. She was ready for work. She was home. And what next? Semyonov asked sarcastically, folding his arms across his chest. Will you follow the scent? Or will the birds sing to you where your friend is hiding? Ivan slowly turned to him. His gaze was as cold as the icy water in a mountain river. Next, Captain, you return to the city and report to the major that you have delivered us to the location. And wait. We'll get in touch when we have something to report. There was no anger or irritation in his voice, only calm, unshakable confidence. Semyonov wanted to argue, to sneer again, but the words stuck in his throat. He suddenly felt out of place, superfluous. He was a stranger in this world that belonged to this strange man and his dog. He silently got into the car, turned around, and, raising a cloud of dust, drove back to his familiar, safe reality. When the sound of the engine faded, Raven took a deep breath. He inhaled the air of the taiga, clean, resinous, smelling of pine needles
damp earth, and rotting leaves. It was the smell of home.
He closed his eyes for a moment, tuning in, merging with this world. When he opened them again, there was nothing human or urban in them. They were the eyes of a beast. He looked at Shadow and nodded slightly. The dog sprang from its place and silently disappeared into the undergrowth. It did not bark or whine. It began to work. Its task was to find the first trace, the trace of the man who had brought his urban chaos here, into this world of order. The Raven was in no hurry. He knew that Anatoly would be cautious. He would cover his tracks, walk on rocks and stream beds, use all the tricks that he himself had once taught him. But he also knew that Anatoly had a burden to bear, a heavy, uncomfortable, resistant burden, in the form of a pampered city actor. Suvorov was not used to such transitions. He would get tired, become capricious, slow down, and that would make Anatoly nervous, rush him, and make mistakes. It was these mistakes that the Raven was looking for. About an hour passed before the Shadow gave a signal, a quiet, abrupt bark. Raven found her by an old fallen cedar tree. The dog was sitting on the ground, pointing her nose at a barely noticeable detail that a city person would never have seen. Flattened moss. Not just flattened, but scraped to the ground. As if someone had slipped and dragged a heavy boot across it. Raven knelt down. He didn't just look at the footprint. He read it. The tread mark was deep, the ground beneath the moss crushed. The person who left it was carrying a heavy load. He walked heavily, uncertainly. Nearby was another footprint, more blurred, left by shoes with thin city soles. Surov. He stumbled, and Anatoly most likely supported him, losing his balance for a moment. The Raven rose. Now, he had a direction. He moved forward, the Shadow following him, keeping slightly to the side. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning every bush, every tree. He saw what was invisible to others. Here was a broken branch at human height, broken not by the wind, but by a careless movement, by someone who was not used to walking in the forest. Here was a barely noticeable piece of dark, expensive fabric caught on a thorny bush. Surov's jacket. And here was the most important thing, a clue that told him everything about the condition of his opponent. On the ground, next to the boot prints, he saw several drops. Not water. He touched them with his finger and brought them to his nose. A sharp, familiar smell. Valerian. Anatoly was at his limit. His nerves were stretched tight as a string. He was not a cold-blooded killer, a professional kidnapper. He was a hunted, lost man who had taken on an impossible burden. His idealistic plan had cracked when it collided with the harsh, unyielding reality. Voron felt not malice, but something akin to pity. He saw in these tracks not an enemy, but an old friend who had lost his way, lost in his own imaginary forest of justice. And now it was Ivan's duty to bring him back, but not to a prison cell, not to the indifferent city court. He had to bring Anatoly to another court, to the court of the taiga itself. He decided for himself. He would not simply pursue him as a policeman pursues a criminal. He would hunt him down, as a wolf hunts a fellow wolf who has broken the laws of the pack. He would corner him,
He would deprive him of food and sleep, make him feel not like a judge, but like a victim. He had to make Anatoly look in the mirror that nature itself would hold up to him and see that, in trying to uproot the diseased tree, he himself had turned into dead wood, disrupting the harmony and balance. This would be his sentence and his redemption. The hunt turned into a slow, exhausting duel that lasted several days. Time lost its urban, measured pace, and was now measured not in hours, but in kilometers traveled, the changing of day and night, and the degree of fatigue that accumulated in the muscles with a leaden heaviness. Ivan and Shadow followed a trail that was becoming increasingly clear, increasingly desperate. Anatoly no longer tried to hide with his former skill. His path was a straight line drawn through the taiga, a line of flight, not tactical retreat. Raven could read it in his every step. Haste, nervousness, and growing panic were evident in how carelessly he broke branches, how deeply his boots sank into the damp ground, how often he stopped to rest, leaving behind trampled grass and traces of impatient waiting. On the second day of the journey, the weather began to deteriorate. The sky was covered with a thick gray veil, and a cold, piercing wind brought with it the smell of snow. For Ivan, this was an alarming sign. In the mountains, the weather changed rapidly and mercilessly. If it started snowing, he could lose the trail. But what was even worse, the snow could be a death sentence for Surov. Weakened and unprepared, the city dweller would not be able to withstand the severe cold. The conflict intensified over time, turning into a race against death. Now Ivan had to hurry, but rushing in the taiga is a tracker's worst enemy. It causes you to make mistakes and miss important details. He had to constantly balance on the edge, pushing himself but not losing his concentration. He walked, completely immersed in the process, his mind working like a complex, perfectly tuned mechanism. He didn't just see the tracks. He thought like Anatoly. He predicted his route, based not on logic, but on the psychology of survival that they had both absorbed many years ago. Here, at the fork in the two gorges, Anatoly would choose the left one. It was longer but safer, while the right one was notorious for rock falls. And here, at the mountain river, he would not look for a ford, but would walk over fallen trees, so as not to get his feet wet and leave footprints in the water. Ivan knew his friend, knew his habits, his fears, his strengths and weaknesses. And he used this knowledge to shorten the journey, to breathe down his neck, to constantly remind him of his invisible presence. By the end of the third day, when they had already reached the foot of the pass leading to the witch's bald spot, Raven found something that finally convinced him that his tactics were correct. Under an overhanging rock, in a small dry cave, he discovered a cache. Several cans of stew, a bag of crackers, biscuits, and, most importantly, a small first aid kit with painkillers and bandages. It was a cache that Anatoly had prepared in advance for the return trip, when, according to his plan, he was supposed to be alone. The fact that he was using it now spoke volumes. His calculations had not worked out. The burden of carrying Surov was heavier than he had expected, and the supplies were running out faster. Ivan sat down on a rock in front of the cache. Shadow lay down at his feet, resting his head on his paws, and stared intently at his master. Voron was faced with a moral choice, one of those that the taiga presents to a person to test their strength. He could take everything. Leave Anatoly without food, condemning him to hunger and quick surrender. That would be the easiest, most effective way to end the hunt. But that was not his way. He was not an executioner. He was a judge.
His goal was not to break a man physically, but to make him admit his spiritual defeat. He opened one of the cans of stew and shared it with Shadow. Then he took 2 more cans, half of the crackers and biscuits, and put them in his backpack.
He was slowing Anatoly down, robbing him of his confidence in tomorrow. But he was leaving him a chance to fight, a chance to think, a chance to realize. But most importantly, he touched the first aid kit. He opened it.
Inside were standard medicines, but he was looking for something else. And he found it. A small bottle of valerian tincture, almost empty. Anatoly was on the verge of a nervous breakdown.
Ivan carefully closed the first aid kit and put it back in its place. He did not touch the medicines. His judgment was harsh, but not inhumane. His goal was not death, but justice as he understood it. He stood up and slung the heavy backpack over his shoulder. The wind picked up, and the first few rare snowflakes began to fall from the sky. They melted before reaching the ground. But this was only the beginning. The race was entering its final, most dangerous phase. He looked up at the dark, almost sheer slope of the pass, where the cursed winter hut was hidden behind the clouds. Now, he knew for sure. The finale of this story would be played out there, and the price of each next step would be immeasurably higher. The final push to the pass was torture. The snow, which at first seemed like nothing more than an annoying nuisance, turned into a full-blown blizzard. The wind howled in the gorges like a hungry beast, throwing icy flakes into his face, blinding his eyes and burning his skin. Visibility dropped to a few meters. The world narrowed to a white, swirling veil in which it was easy to lose not only the trail, but also oneself. Ivan walked with his head bowed low, navigating almost blindly, relying on memory and instinct. He trusted the shadow, which glided ahead like a gray ghost, never losing the trail, even under a layer of fresh snow. Every step required incredible effort. His feet sank into the snowdrifts, and the cold air burned his lungs. But they did not stop. They knew that stopping in such weather was tantamount to death. The winter hut appeared suddenly out of the blizzard, like a ghost ship emerging from the fog. It was an old, weathered log cabin, its roof covered with snow. It seemed less like a building and more like a part of the landscape itself, a natural extension of the rock to which it clung. No smoke came from the chimney. The windows were dark and lifeless. At first glance, the place seemed abandoned, but Raven knew that was not the case. Anatoly was here. Or at least, he had been here. Very recently. He could sense it in the tension in the air, in the way the shadow froze at his feet, growling quietly, not at the hut, but at the rocks surrounding it. Ivan signaled the dog to stay put, and taking his rifle from his shoulder, began to slowly circle the winter hut in a wide arc. He moved silently, like a shadow, blending in with the falling snow. He was looking for signs of a trap, snares, traps, any details that might reveal Anatoly's hostile intentions. But there was nothing. On the contrary, the path to the door had been cleared. Carelessly, but obviously, someone had been here very recently. This was not a shelter being prepared for defense. It was an invitation. Anatoly was waiting for him. He wanted to be found. He approached the door. It was not locked, only closed. He pushed it with his shoulder. The door creaked open, letting in a gust of wind and snow. The winter hut was dim and cold. It smelled of dampness, old wood, and something else.
something sour and unpleasant. The smell of long-standing animal fear. Ivan froze on the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. Inside, everything was as he remembered it. A roughly knocked-together table, 2 benches, an iron stove in the corner, and bunks along the far wall. There was a kerosene lamp on the table. Next to it, several cans of food and a flask of water. And then, he saw him. In the darkest corner, curled up on the bunk, sat a man. He was covered with an old holey sheepskin coat, and at first Ivan couldn't make out his face. The man was rocking from side to side like a pendulum, muttering something under his breath. It was an indistinct, monotonous moaning, without words or meaning. Ivan slowly moved closer. A shadow slipped behind him and froze at his feet, whimpering quietly. The man on the bunk raised his head. It was Nikolai Surov. But this was not the Surov that Voron had seen in photographs and posters. Not the brilliant, self-absorbed premier. The king of the stage. He was looking at a creature in which human features were barely discernible. His face, covered with stubble, was gray and earthy. His eyes, once burning with the fire of talent and pride, were now empty, faded, like those of an old, discarded doll. He looked at Ivan, but did not see him. His gaze was turned inward, into some abyss of horror in which he now dwelled. He was not physically injured. There was not a scratch on him. Anatoly had not touched him with a finger. He had done something worse. He had broken him. Ivan looked around the winter hut. Now he began to notice details that had escaped him at first. The walls were covered with sheets of paper torn from some book. Phrases were underlined on them, quotes about sin, atonement, moral decline. Next to the bunks, on the floor, lay the charred remains of Surov's expensive belongings. A cashmere coat, leather gloves, a silk scarf. Anatoly methodically destroyed everything that connected this man to his past life, to his brilliant, false mask. He didn't just hold him captive. He lectured him. He conducted a monstrous psychological experiment on him, trying to burn out all the corruption from his soul as he understood it. Surov, a man accustomed to worship, found himself locked in a cage with a silent, relentless judge who, day after day, showed him a mirror reflecting all his insignificance. And his mind couldn't take it. Voron approached Surov and threw his pea jacket over his shoulders. The actor shuddered, but did not resist. He was like a child, obedient and passive. Ivan poured water into a flask and brought it to his lips. Surov gulped greedily, choking a little. He was alive, physically, but his soul was dead. And at that moment, Ivan understood. Anatoly was not there. He had left his broken victim and gone, but he was somewhere nearby. He was watching. This winter hut, this broken man, it was not the end of his plan. It was a final message to Ivan. A message and a warning. Look what I did to him. Look what I am capable of. Now it's your turn. Now it's our judgment. Ivan left the hut. The blizzard had subsided a little. He looked at the rocks surrounding the winter hut, at the snow-capped peaks lost in the clouds. He was on stage. Anatoly had prepared it for their final meeting. It would not be just a duel between two former friends. It would be a duel of honor.
But according to the cruel, merciless laws of this wild, primitive world, he would not attack from behind. He would come face to face. Raven knew this.
He felt his gaze on him, cold and attentive. The gaze of a hunter who had finally waited for his most important prey. The first thing to do was to light a fire.
Not so much for warmth as to bring back a spark of life to this cursed place, to dispel the darkness and the smell of decay that permeated the very walls of the winter hut.
Ivan lit the potbelly stove using dry wood chips that Anatoly had thoughtfully left in the corner. Dry, even logs, stacked in a perfect pile. Even in this chaos, he remained true to his inner order.
The flames were slow to catch, but soon they roared in the chimney,
and a lively, life-saving warmth spread through the hut. Surov, wrapped in Voron's pea jacket, did not react.
He continued to sit on the bunk, staring at one point, his mind wandering somewhere far away in the icy desert of the horror he had experienced. Ivan boiled water in a kettle and brewed strong tea from taiga herbs, which he always carried with him. He poured a little alcohol from his flask into a mug and almost forced the actor to take a few sips. Surov drank obediently, like a machine, feeling neither the taste nor the burning heat. Ivan understood that he couldn't leave him here alone, but dragging him along to meet Anatoly would be madness. He looked around. Behind the stove was a small niche for firewood, deep enough and protected from the wind.
He carried Surov there, laid him on a pile of old sheepskin coats, and covered him with everything he could find. "I'll be back," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure the actor could hear him. Then he left the winter hut.
The blizzard had subsided as suddenly as it had begun. The world around him was transformed. White, clean, untouched. A vast space, ringing with silence, covered with fresh snow. The perfect setting for the finale.
Raven did not look for Anatoly's tracks. He knew it was pointless. Anatoly would find him himself. He walked a few dozen meters away from the hut to an open plateau overlooking the gorge.
He took his rifle off his shoulder, but did not prepare it for action, simply leaning it against a large boulder.
He sat down on a rock, took out his old hunting knife, darkened by time, and began to carve a small figure of a bird out of a piece of pine bark. He waited. He did not hide. He accepted the challenge. He appeared about an hour later.
Not like a ghost, not like a shadow. He simply emerged from behind a rocky outcrop, as if he had always been part of the landscape. Anatoly Versailles.
Tall, thin, with a weather-beaten, stone-carved face, and eyes that sparkled with the cold fire of fanaticism. He was dressed in the same hiking outfit as in the old photograph, only now it was worn and faded. He held a carbine in his hands, but, like Ivan, did not raise it. He stopped 20 paces away, and they looked at each other in deafening silence, broken only by the quiet whistle of the wind. "I knew you would come," said Anatoly. His voice was calm, devoid of emotion. "You couldn't not come. You're the only one who could read my tracks." "Your tracks were screaming, Tolya," Ivan replied just as calmly, without stopping what he was doing. "They were screaming with despair and uncertainty. They weren't the tracks of a predator, but of a man who was lost." Anatoly smiled bitterly. "I'm not lost, Vanya. On the contrary,
For the first time in many years, I found the right path. I came to your sick forest to cut down a rotten tree, and I did it. Look at it. He nodded toward the winter hut. It was a tumor that poisoned everything around it. Lies, greed, debauchery. I didn't kill it. I cleaned it out. I made it look at itself for real, without makeup and applause. I showed him the laws of nature. The strongest survive, not in body, but in spirit. And he turned out to be weak. Nature itself rejected him. He spoke with the conviction of a prophet, with faith in his own supreme righteousness. He truly believed that he had become the hand of providence, a surgeon who had come to rid the world of filth. Do you think it was nature's judgment? Ivan put down the knife and the almost finished figurine. He looked his former friend straight in the eye. No. It was the judgment of a man possessed by pride. Nature does not judge, Talia. It simply exists. A wolf kills a deer not because the deer is sinful, but because the wolf is hungry. It is part of the balance. And you brought a human idea into this world, the idea of purity. You imagined yourself a judge. But what kind of judge tortures his victim? You didn't heal him. You broke his mind, trampled his soul. That's not strength. That's cruelty. And there's no natural law in that. Only human malice, covered up with pretty words about justice. And your law is better? Anatoly's voice rang with metal. Your city law in paper folders? Which will release him in a couple of years for good behavior, which will allow him to lie again, betray again, poison the lives of others again. I've seen how your system works. It doesn't heal. It cripples. It creates even bigger monsters. I wanted him to understand his depravity, to atone for his sins, not before your corrupt judge, but before something higher, before eternity. And I brought him here so that you, Vanya, could be a witness, so that you could confirm my verdict. You see this rot, too. You've always seen it. I thought you were on my side. It was a cry from the heart, a desperate attempt to find justification, to find a kindred spirit in this cold, silent world. And for a moment, Ivan felt sorry for him. He stood up. I am on the side of order, Talia. Real order. And you have violated it. You think you have the right to decide who lives and who dies, which tree is sick and which is healthy. But who gave you that right? Who made you the judge? Look at yourself. You wanted to become a force of nature, but you became just a person. A tired, confused, lonely person who decided that his pain gave him the right to cause pain to others. You yourself became the very thing you were fighting against. You yourself have become a sick specimen that disrupts harmony. You have broken our main law, the law of the taiga. Do not kill without need. Do not torment the weak. Do not put yourself above others. You have betrayed everything we believed in. Each of Ivan's words was like a blow. He did not strike Anatoly's body, but the very foundation of his worldview. He used Anatoly's own weapon, his own code of honor. And Anatoly, faltered. His confidence, his fanatical belief in his own righteousness began to crack. He looked at his hands, at the carbine, then shifted his gaze to the dark doorway of the winter hut, where the man he had broken sat. And for the first time in all this time, doubt flashed in his eyes. And then pain, realization. He had lost. He had lost not in a shootout, but in the main battle, the battle of truths. Slowly, as if in a dream, he lowered his rifle onto the snow. Then he took a rolled-up package out of his inside pocket and threw it at Ivan's feet. Everything is here. Documents, records, evidence of his machinations for your city's justice. He looked at Ivan, and there was a strange, desperate plea in his eyes. Take me back, Vanya. Follow my own footsteps. I have to walk this path again, to understand where I went wrong. It was his atonement,
An admission of defeat. He wasn't surrendering to the police. He was surrendering to his old friend, who had turned out to be wiser, stronger, closer to the truth he had been so desperately seeking. Ivan nodded silently.
He picked up the bag and Anatoly's rifle. The trial was over. The verdict had been handed down. And now they had a long, very long way back to go. A path following the tracks that led from the heart of darkness to the ghostly light of repentance. The return journey was a painful meditation, a silent procession of three shadows across the white shroud of the taiga. The snow had stopped, and a vast, piercing blue sky stretched over the mountains, cold and indifferent in its crystal clarity. They followed the tracks that Anatoly had left, on the white camp. Now they led back to the world he had left, and to which he was about to return as a prisoner. He walked first, without shackles, without an escort. Ivan simply followed a few steps behind, with his rifle on his back and Shadow at his feet. Anatoly made no attempt to run. He was no longer here. His body methodically measured out steps in the snow, but his mind was immersed in a long, difficult pilgrimage into himself. He stared at his own footprints as if reading in them the chronicle of his downfall, trying to find that very turn, that wrong step that had led him from the ideals of justice to the cruelty of the executioner. There was more repentance in his silence than in 1,000 confessions. Surov was third. He was the heaviest burden, a hindrance that slowed them down and filled the air with the smell of broken will. Even made him a kind of sled out of poles and ropes, on which the actor could sit while they crossed the most difficult sections. But for the most part, he forced him to walk. Every step was difficult for Surov. He stumbled, fell, and whimpered quietly from the cold and fatigue. Physical suffering was something new and real for him, and paradoxically, it pulled him out of the abyss of madness into which Anatoly had plunged him. He began to feel. At first it was only pain and cold, then fear. He looked at Anatoly's back, and his eyes reflected a primal horror of his tormentor. He looked at Ivan and couldn't understand who this man was. A savior or another judge. The taiga healed his soul with the cruelest of medicines. Reality. There was no applause, no makeup, no spotlights here. Only cold, pain, and an endless silent forest that didn't care about his talent or his suffering. Ivan was a silent observer of this strange procession. He led them like a shepherd leads lost sheep, but he did not feel like a savior. only an executor of the will of something greater. He looked at his former friend, and in his heart there was neither malice nor the triumph of a victor, only a quiet, dull sadness. He saw before him not a criminal, but a tragic figure. A man who loved order so much that in his attempt to protect it, he created chaos. He looked at Surov and felt neither pity nor sympathy for him. To him, he was just a sick specimen, a foreign element that had been removed from its environment and now had to be returned to its place. The mission was almost complete. The balance, disrupted by the intrusion of human passions into the natural world, was on the verge of being restored. They reached the edge of the forest at the end of the 5th day. Semenov's old Uaz was standing in the same place where they had left it. The captain himself was smoking by the campfire, and a little further away, leaning against the hood of the police car, stood Major Gromov. Seeing 3 figures slowly emerging from behind the trees, they jumped up. Semenov stared at them in disbelief. He had expected to see anything: a shootout, corpses, a single victor. But what he saw was this strange, silent procession. A broken actor, a submissive criminal, and a weary tracker. His urban, rational mind refused to understand what had happened here. There was no struggle, no chase in the sense he was used to. There was something else, something ancient, that did not fit into the framework of protocols and articles of the criminal code. Gromov silently approached Ivan. He looked at Anatoly, then at Surov, and there was understanding in his eyes. He didn't ask anything. He just handed Voron a flask of hot tea. "Is it over?" he asked quietly. Ivan nodded. "He'll go with you voluntarily. And this one," he nodded at Surov, "needs help." Not from the police, but from doctors. Anatoly himself approached Semyonov and held out his hands for the handcuffs. The captain, still in a daze, awkwardly snapped them onto his wrists. At that moment, Anatoly looked at Ivan. There was no hatred or resentment in his gaze. Only gratitude. Gratitude for stopping him, for judging him according to the only law he respected. Then he silently got into the police car. Surov, who began to cry quietly when he saw people and civilization, was put into a UAZ. Gromov handed Ivan the package of documents that Anatoly had given him. "This is enough to put him away for a long time," said the major, referring to Surov. "Blackmail, financial fraud. Even if he doesn't talk about the kidnapping, he's finished. The theater will be cleansed." Ivan said nothing. He watched as the cars turned around and drove away, taking 2 people, 2 broken lives, back to the world where they belonged. When the sound of the engines faded, he was left alone with the taiga. He took a deep breath. It was all over. He didn't go with them. He refused the reports, the glory of being a savior, the cash reward. His work was done. He had fulfilled his duty, not to the law, but to the truth as he understood it. He asked Gromov to leave him the UAZ for a couple of days so he could get to his cabin. Driving through the city, he deliberately made a detour. He stopped on the opposite side of the street from the Northern Lights Theater. The evening lights were already on. A huge new poster hung on the facade, announcing the premiere of the next season. Nikolai Surov's name was covered with a wide white strip, on which the name of another actor was hastily written by hand. Igor, the show must go on.
The ecosystem, having gotten rid of the diseased tree, had already found a replacement for it. Lies, intrigues, fake gold. None of it had gone anywhere. It had simply changed its mask.
The theater was preparing for a new deception, and the audience was already lining up the tickets. Ivan smiled bitterly. He started the engine and drove away. He stopped the car where this story began, at the edge of the forest. He took out his backpack and slung his rifle over his shoulder. The shadow, wagging its tail happily, was already waiting for him by the path.
Ivan took one last look at the distant lights of the city,
At this huge, bustling anthill living by its own strange, artificial laws. He had done what he had to do. Justice had been served. But not the kind written in codes, the kind that dissolves in the air, in the rustling of leaves, in the silence of the mountains. The law of balance. He turned his back on the city, took a step, and together with shadow, disappeared into the green gloom of the taiga. Their mission was complete. Order had been restored.